Good morning and welcome to Energy Shots. We're 10 days after the start of Operation Epic Fury, where the United States and Israel are now waging a robust air campaign against Iran. Iran's leadership has been killed, much of its weaponry has been decimated, but its response has caused death, destruction, and a blockage of the Strait of Hormuz in the Gulf region. This is a scenario that creates incredible peril for global energy markets and lives of people throughout the Middle East. Kevin, welcome to Energy Shots. It's good to see you.
Good morning, Joseph. Good to be back in person with you.
I always enjoy our conversations. Clearly, this is one of the things that energy analysts, one of the scenarios that energy analysts look at, have nightmares about. What are you thinking today?
We've literally been talking about this for decades. Today, I see a post. It is from 8:28 a.m. from Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, Ali Larijani. He says, Strait of Hormuz will either be a strait of peace and prosperity for all, or will be a strait of defeat and suffering for warmongers. So those 11 days you've talked about, those are 11 days where we have not had normal traffic in the strait. But before we get into that, I have a question for you.
Hit me.
Do you think laziness is a sin, or at least a bad habit?
I think it's definitely a bad habit.
Okay, well, I think markets will punish those who suffer from that habit based on what happened yesterday. The price movement that we saw in crude oil. If you were deciding that maybe you'd take a couple hours off in the afternoon because you knew where this was going after we ticked a tad below $120 a barrel, you got a little bit of correction from the market.
Yes.
If you think about just sort of the 100 million barrels a day and $30 of price movement, that's $3 billion. Take it out the option chain and you have many multiples of that. We're talking about significant, unthinkably large amounts of money being affected. And that doesn't go into the second order costs of the energy.
Well, let's break down for a second what happened last night, because I think it's a good preview of what we want to talk about today. So early Monday morning, DC time, we had prices up toward $120 a barrel, 118, I think, on the Brent price was the highest one I saw. By the end of the day, President Trump spoke late in the afternoon here in Washington, said the war is almost over, and prices precipitously dropped down to about $90 a barrel, where they're about right now. Is that trader sentiment, trafficking in the war? Is it algorithms? Is it physical? Is it expectations of physical balance is changing? How do you read it?
Well, I have a thought and I have a bit of a visual commentary. The thought, I'll get to in a moment. The visual commentary is, this being Tuesday, I'm wearing a taco tie. You might not be able to see it, viewers, online. It's a vestige, it's a Vineyards Vines tie from long ago. I haven't worn it in years. The last time I did, one of the associates at my old firm said, "How did you manage to throw up so perfectly on your tie?" So it's been in the closet ever since. But it seems appropriate because the question is, are we stepping down? Are we, the United States, stepping down? Because if you look at what we are hearing out of Iran, who has a vote in all this too, it doesn't sound like they are. It doesn't sound like they're going to capitulate, in the words of Special Envoy for Peace, Steve Witkoff. And it does seem like the price at the pump could produce something like capitulation, or at least political retrenchment here in the United States.
And that does seem to be what we're, when we're watching commentary from Iranian leadership, when we're looking at what the market is trying to predict the president may do, there is this kind of an assumption that he's sort of in the driving seat for all of this, which over time we may find that to be less true, only for the American actions. The sense is that in closing off the Strait of Hormuz, preventing 20 million barrels a day of normal traffic, much of which cannot be diverted, causing extreme disturbance in global LNG markets because of the loss of Qatari LNG exports, that the energy prices will cause political consternation in the United States. It will cause blowback around the world, and lasting long enough, flirts with recession.
Well, yes, that second part about lasting long enough, I think, is the operative question. A week or a week and a half of this, we might be on the other side of it. It's a blip. Voters may recall a lot longer than markets do, and the inflationary consequences could be minimal. This goes sustained for some period of time. What is starting to happen, and I think we'll get into this in a moment when we get to the slides, could have enduring consequences, because even the most graceful shutdowns of energy assets can tend to take a long time to come back, days to weeks.
Right.
So when this is over, it's still not necessarily over.
Well, why don't we dive in and talk a little bit about what's actually happening and how physical balances and markets are responding.
Why don't you set the stage for us then?
Of course. Now, as you said, Kevin, the Strait of Hormuz is this like key factor in what's going on today, because the Iranians have said that they want traffic. They will act to halt traffic. Now, there's 4 vectors along which they can do that: land-based anti-ship missiles, fast speedboats. Their blue water navy has largely been destroyed by American and Israeli action, but there's a host of small craft loaded along the southern coast of Iran which can still be used to interfere with traffic. You've got mines and you've got drones, both those that fly and those that swim. And the threat of all of that has paused traffic almost entirely throughout the strait. Insurers and shipping companies are saying this is not worth the motion. So what are we looking at here? In blue and green, we've got ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. This is tankers only, not containers, not LNG traffic. In 2024 and 2025, from the middle of February to the early part of March. And what you saw there is about 60 crossings a day. Ships can cross the Strait of Hormuz in either direction, one at a time. It's only tens of miles across at its most narrow points. And in red here, you've got 2026. Things were progressing fine. Everything was going well. We hit the start of Operation Epic Fury, and please pardon the interpolation of there being no leap year this year, but we careened down to near zero. There's still a few tankers going through, turning off their AISs. Maybe they're Chinese or shipping Iranian oil. They feel like they can make the run or shoot the strait. But this is almost a near complete halt to what is normally a very busy area of marine traffic.
And the consequences for that for global markets are pretty clear. Maybe we can go back to one of the principles we've discussed on this show so many times before on the next slide, which is one of the strongest relationships in oil markets is the inverse correlation between inventories and price. We've been down this road. We knew that we had big inventories. I think we'll get into this in a little bit. Big builds over the last several years, and especially last year. But that's changing, and you would expect prices to change. Now, markets look ahead. Did you ever watch those nature shows when the lions would go after the gazelles?
Yes, of course.
I mean, there's a certain school of thought that the lion is beautiful. This is nature at work, but not if you're a gazelle. This is nature at work when the market moves.
Right.
Right. So those market movements took that red line on the previous chart and said, what happens if this doesn't restart?
Right.
And they looked ahead at the consequences of losing throughput in the oil system, which means that you can't produce if you can't move the product of your efforts. And so that you have to shut in those facilities and extrapolating forward. So starting with this principle, let's talk a little bit. At 8:45 today, my understanding is that the G7 finance ministers were supposed to get together to talk again about a coordinated drawdown of strategic reserves under the auspices of the International Energy Agency. Since we're doing this at 9, I don't know how that's turned out yet, but that goes back to a word from our sponsor, Infomo. Like regular fear of missing out, but for information, we live in an age of Infomo.
It's incredibly hard to go on the record at this moment because things are so volatile. In 15 minutes can change markets, as we talked about before, can change the course of history.
Let's go to the next slide and size those strategic reserves and alternate routes. So the IEA says 15 million barrels per day of crude, the black part of this bar, and 5 million barrels per day of products traverse the strait in 2025.
And just to be clear, almost all of this is headed out.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
Right. And so important for the world supply, but especially in Asia. Now, if we were to take the existing nameplate capacity of strategic reserves plus the full capacity of alternate routes west from Saudi Arabia and into the Gulf of Oman from the Emirates, you get to almost 20 million barrels per day. So stack this up. But if you look more carefully at history and you say, how much of those non-U.S. strategic reserves, products and crude have been drawn down? How much of the U.S. reserve was drawn down in 2022 when the Biden administration had a big problem and had to fill a big hole? You get a much smaller number. And if you look at the available capacity remaining in those two pipelines, we're at about 1/3, about 30% even, of that sort of full replacement. So on a flowing barrels basis, the strategic reserves and alternate routes cannot close this gap.
So the gap starts at 20.
Right?
Right? So if you halt all traffic, that goes nearly to zero. Some of that oil can be rerouted through the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, through a pipeline from the UAE down to the coast outside the Strait of Hormuz.
Correct.
Not trivial, small volumes. If we release at a historical basis everything else, we might restore 5, maybe 6 of that.
Yeah, this is about 6 million barrels per day, and that counts an increment on the East-West pipeline, assuming about 2 million barrels per day going through it right now, assuming 1.1 going out through Fujairah in the Gulf. So, but yeah, it's not going to fill the hole.
Right.
So what you get in market action then is the market saying, well, at some point, supply has to balance demand and price is going to do the work. Now, if you ask, where are we really looking ahead? We're really looking ahead at the inventory picture. And so when you start assuming that there are going to be shut-ins, and this is work Clearview did just a couple of days ago, speaking of overtaken by events, very conservative estimate looking at crude only in just the OPEC countries in the Gulf.
Right.
And saying, what could we get on an average monthly basis from different countries shutting in if you run over the course of the month? And we start to fill inventories over the first 10 days of March, and the shut-ins began, which is happening. And we get to essentially 6.7 million barrels per day of average shut-in in April. Now, interestingly, this morning, Bloomberg reported that Iraq had shut in 2.9 million barrels per day. Kuwait had shut in 0.5. Saudi Arabia was between 2 and 2.5. And the Emirates was between 0.5 and 0.8, which actually comes to where we would be at the end of April on our average for April already. So that's what you get with conservative estimates. But if you go forward to the next slide, again, to contrast what our conservative estimate implies for the world, this is calendar 25. These are the EIA's numbers for taking global consumption on and putting supply, subtracting global consumption. What is the overage? What is the surplus? And these very big monthly numbers on average barrel per day bases, including predictions of 3.9 million barrels per day of surplus for January, for March, and 3.4 for April. What we said is, well, no, it could be -3 and -6.8. And that was conservative. So that's an enormous hole in inventories, which comes back to what is the IEA action or the G7 action available to do? And the answer is not to plug the hole today, but to shore up those lost production barrels in inventories for tomorrow, to provide more price stability in the future.
So this is an interesting concept. And, we wrote a piece last week. There was an Experts React. You were a contributor. A few more of our non-resident associates all jumped in. And one of the messages that came out of that was the global oil market had been pretty well supplied for the last year and a half. And that meant that storage tankers floating on the sea, carried a lot of oil, and there was some buffer in the system to an interruption that now is 10 days old. But what you're saying, what I'm reading here is, we're losing more in a day than we were losing in by month. Is that right?
Well, I think not precisely, but what it is saying is that if you were looking at where we were going and where we could be headed, very conservatively, it outmatches the surplus.
Got it.
And this is the trend line. This is the future as it looks today, which is why markets would be setting such a high premium on the interruption. And if you want to change the future, if you want to calibrate your response, not just for the moment, but for the latency that follows when this is over, because when this is over, it's still not over. Then there's still a reasonable case for a release. So we'll see what they do.
So this actually is a great thing to talk about. Our next slide, where we looked, we're showing here, the oil price. So one of the things that presidents, political leaders, the IEA are going to look at is oil prices around the world, which are a direct correlate of the inventory of oil in the marketplace, correct? And we're showing here in green the nominal Brent price for the last 25 years. And let's talk about the dashed line in a second. But we had been running along fairly well. Prices were down in the 60s, and then this shows us this blob at the end here, about $90, which was the closing price last night, and then the range of volatility we saw in the last day. So, let's think about coordinated release of strategic reserves. The last time we saw a major interruption or potential interruption in the global oil market was in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The IEA and the G7 at that point did release strategic reserves, but prices reached 130 and kind of stayed there for a little bit before they took that action. What explains the difference there versus what they might do now? Is it the scale of the interruption that we're seeing today and the potential loss of inventory going forward that they would consider moving before prices reach the high levels that they had before?
Yeah, I think it's that they're thinking about the inflationary consequences of prices staying high for a long time. So if you take the numbers that we projected for March and April, my colleague Jacques Rousseau came up with in our report a couple of days ago, and you multiply out by the number of the days in a month and you sum them, you get about 300 million barrels of inventory loss over March and April. The stories that came out yesterday morning said, well, 300 to 400 million barrels of strategic reserves could be released, which would be the largest collective action in IEA history. It would also be somewhere between 25% and 33% of government-controlled strategic stockpiles in the world. Now, there's two ways to think about that. One is the market says, oh, thank God you're coming to the rescue. The other side of that is, oh my God, you're doing that? And so I think there may be some consequences to that action. As you start to draw down that security blanket in a moment of acute distress, you also are saying to the market, we're burning that security blanket in a moment of acute distress.
I mean, it's like that film, The Gattaca, right? You never save anything for the swim back. And when the cause of this disruption is a war, which is indeterminate in when it will end, indeterminate in when this disruption will be released, do we risk giving too much away now, trying to protect prices, and losing strategic reserves we might want later?
Yeah, and this is a negotiating process that has happened in past collective actions, including during the Russian invasion of Ukraine and also the Libyan crisis in 2011. And the lag time, among other things in 2011, reflected some of the concerns about using this too soon because these are barrels that cannot be replaced. And so the administration has taken some creative steps over the course of the war. One of them, which happened on March 5th, was General License 133 from the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Treasury Department, allowing previously loaded Russian barrels on shadow tankers to go to Indian refiners through April 4th.
Right.
Now that idea was that, well, these are barrels that are available to take the edge off of the price right now in an importing economy that is Hormuz reliant.
Don't leave them floating. Let them get into India.
Yesterday, the president said a couple of things. Well, he said a number of things that I think we all paid attention to, including that the war might be over, but also that we might be going further, which leaves us some ambiguity. But then he said that they would be looking at sanctions relief for some countries that have sanctions. I think one of the countries we're probably thinking of is Russia, and that maybe the sanctions wouldn't even come back on afterwards.
Yep.
Now, part of the power of strategic reserves is mentioning strategic reserves. And so some of the price action we saw yesterday correlated with the mention in the media of that IEA discussion. And I suspect that some of the mention of sanctions relief may have had a price effect. Actually doing it has other consequences. Now, the second thing, though, and I think this gets to sort of where we go from here.
Yeah.
The strait is still closed. This problem is not over yet.
Right.
And we are hearing, as you mentioned, the anti-ship missiles, which seem like they could be much harder to root out than some of the bigger ballistic missiles with visible launchers in fixed locations or less mobile locations. But then also mines. We're hearing about mine-sweeping operations. The president mentioned it twice in his press conference yesterday. I believe it came up again this morning when the Secretary of War and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were speaking as well. So there are threats to transportation in the Strait that could still worsen, even as we hope for things to improve.
Well, in that context, the U.S. has deployed military assets we have minesweepers in the region, we have planes that can do overwatch. The president has said the U.S. Navy and possibly allied navies will come to help convoy tankers in and out of the straits. But let's not pretend that that's not going to be a hugely laborious process. You're going to have to group them. The logistics of that problem are non-trivial, though if the war continues, countries are going to need relief from the scale of this disruption and probably will have no other option.
Is that what we should be watching in the weeks ahead?
I'm watching a couple things in the weeks ahead. We've seen other proposals from the White House trying to deal with the price impacts of this disruption, selling futures, using the Treasury book, using the Treasury's balance sheet to try and keep markets stable That, of course, disconnects pricing information from supply and demand in ways that could exacerbate this problem as much as resolve the political challenges. Of course, we have to watch the source of this disruption, the strategies on both the Iranian, the United States, and the Israeli sides. And I am also thinking we need to look for escalation. Thus far, attacks against oil exporting infrastructure have been, while real and causing damage and loss of life, relatively modest compared to what you might expect. If the conflict continues to escalate, that problem may get yet worse, and then we're looking at a prolonged period of higher prices in global energy markets.
Well, I think those are all very important things. You started with duration being destiny. I think that's still first and foremost. The only thing I would flag in addition to your comprehensive list would be that the president yesterday mentioned retaliatory strikes against Iranian energy and electricity infrastructure. That escalation pathway could spur bilateral sort of back foot, last minute, no holds barred escalation.
Yep.
And we haven't seen that, as you say, yet. Definitely on the radar screen to watch in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, and that maybe we can close here. There is such sensitivity around oil prices, politically and economically. As I was kind of thinking about this problem last night, I went ahead and charted out not just the nominal price, but the inflation-adjusted price of Brent oil over the last 25 years. And I'm not saying it's pleasant, I'm not saying it's good, but we've been here before for prolonged periods of prices in excess of what would be $150, $160 in 2025. If we find ourselves there, what does that mean for substitution? What does that mean for the technology strategies that countries are going to undertake, not wanting to see this happen again?
Well, necessity is the mother of invention, but the products born of invention tend to be undercapitalized, and recession could be the context for that discussion. So on that happy note,
yeah, we should close here.
Yeah, I think so.
Kevin, it's always no better partner to navigate these issues with than you. Thank you for being such a stalwart friend. Colleagues, thank you for joining us. Do check out CSIS's work on this issue. We're publishing commentary and updates regularly. Our colleagues in the China Maritime Transparency Initiative have done a lot of work on what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, and we look forward to bringing you more as this situation develops. We hope you have an energetic day, and if you happen to be in the Gulf, we wish you safety and comfort amidst all this conflict.